Welcome to the Wheelers Centre, where tonight we will be talking about the stalking of Julia Gillard. My name is Jeff Sparrow and I will be facilitating for this evening. Just before we get underway, a quick announcement. Unless you're a brain surgeon on call for the evening, can you please make sure that you've turned your mobile phone into the off position? Even if you are a brain surgeon, put it on off. Your patients can wait for an evening. The way we're going to run things, I'll be conducting a discussion for about 40 minutes or so, and then there will be plenty of time for your comments, questions and other contributions. So if you have anything to say, just bottle it up until the end and then you'll get your go. Before we go any further, let me introduce our three speakers. We're very lucky with the panel for the evening. From my left, your right, we have Kerry-Anne Walsh, who was a long-time political journalist, a former press secretary to the Hawke government, and most importantly, the author of this book, which is the book around which the session is based, The Stalking of Julia Gillard. We also have Jonathan Holmes, also a long-time journalist, both in Britain, in Australia, in many different capacities. You may know him from such television programs as Media Watch, where until recently he was the presenter. And we also have James Button, at the risk of sounding like a stuck record, also a long-time journalist, but a speechwriter and served in many other capacities as well, which no doubt we will get to in the course of the discussion. So if you can please join me in making all three of our guests welcome. All right, I thought I might get us underway by first getting Kerry-Anne to talk a little bit about the book that's brought us all here this evening. So, Kerry-Anne, perhaps we can start. When did you first become aware that Julia Gillard was, in fact, being stalked? And what was it about this stalking that induced you to write a book?
Well, I did start looking at the role of the independents in the Parliament after June 2010. It seemed like a fantastic opportunity to look at a Parliament the likes of which we hadn't had in 60 years. But I rapidly became aware that this was not a story that was engrossing the media in Canberra and a lot of the media outside. And so I just basically started keeping notes and keeping diaries and clipping media files and becoming more and more aware that while the Gillard government was working extremely well, that wasn't being shown in the media portrayal of it. There was a lot of reform agenda, but what we were getting, and I think what media consumers were hearing, listening and seeing, was a picture of a government that was being beset by leadership instability as the months rolled on, that she was a leader that couldn't govern properly, that she had no policy focus, that sort of thing, where in fact the opposite was true. And the independents were extremely praiseworthy of the way she was negotiating things through that Parliament, but we just weren't getting any of that sort of picture through the mainstream media. And so I just started focusing on this, thinking, wow, this is an incredible story, that she's actually doing a remarkably good job, but that picture isn't being portrayed.
Well, I mean, I guess if we were writing a history of parliamentary politics in Australia, you could do a pretty good job in telling it through great political rivalries going back to Hawke v Keating, or Andrew Peacock versus John Howard, or John Howard versus Peter Costello, or the various iterations of Labor
There's
Party.
a few egos around in the
What
politics.
then was different about Team Rudd versus Team Gillard? Was this simply another iteration of a political rivalry, or was there something fundamentally different going on
Well,
here?
it went on for a long time. I know the Howard and Peacock one did also. But at the same time that those rivalries were ongoing, there was also not the obsession by the media on the minutiae of a personality conflict. A lot of other things were being reported at the same time. Policies were actually being reported on. I think we've got to this place in media reporting and in a shrill particularly partisan part of radio land and TV land and commentary and shock jocks, where it's all about the personality conflict and very little, or not enough rather, about substance and what policies mean to Australia and to people who are trying to live their lives out there.
Was there also a particular viciousness to this dispute?
I thought there was incredible
that?
viciousness. I think that some of the treatment she was subjected to and became increasingly subjected to in the wake of the so-called carbon tax that very few of the shock jocks wanted, and the more extreme of the commentators, it just became more and more personal, more and more vile, and a lot of the stuff that was on the internet and some of the things that were said about her were really, I don't know why she didn't say enough's enough.
All right, well, I'll turn specifically to the media in a minute, but I just want to get the other two in on the politics of that. You remember, James, I can start with you. I mean, one of the issues that came up in that period that seemed to be distinct was a sense that the Labor Party itself was becoming increasingly dysfunctional. There was a lot of focus on the so-called faceless men and the factional battles, and I understand there's a factional battle currently going on in Victoria at the moment. Was there something new and different that was happening in the Labor Party then? Or, I mean, I was struck by this because I was just recently reading a quarterly essay by a certain John Button, that you may be familiar with, that touched upon the Labor Party having these problems a decade or so ago. So was something new happening in the Labor Party under the Gillard era, or was it the same thing?
I think, Jeff, this has been running for a long time. Paul Keating once said that the Labor Party is like a bike. You have to keep pedalling or you fall over. And after Keating left, the Labor Party really stopped pedalling. And by that I mean that it stopped reforming itself. If you look at Labor Party history going back, every time they've had a big loss, the leader, Bill Hayden, Gough Whitlam famously, going back to Chifley, engaged in major party reform to update the policy platform and to make the party more relevant. And that didn't happen after 1996, sadly. Particularly under the leadership of Kim Beazley, it didn't happen. Simon Crean had a go, but was only in there a short time. And so when Labor got back into power, it really was a kind of hollowed out shell. And this enabled, I think they chose Rudd reluctantly in 2007 because they thought he would get them back into power. And in a way, I think they've paid the price since in many ways. But it does come out of that structural problem that the party is no longer embedded in the community.
So how did that play out in the Gillard story? And was there something that she could have done and didn't do that could have facilitated that reform?
I think it would have been hard. These are deep structural changes that are needed now to restore the Labor Party to a sense of being connected to the Australian community. It really is a very small outfit now. There's probably about 2,000 active members in Victoria, far less in many other states. It had 11,000 people voted for the national president in 2011. That's a minimum activism, is to vote for your national president. So I think it would have been very hard for Gillard in power to have actually done much about the state of the ALP. But now that they're in opposition, they're in government, but there we go. There's a Freudian slip.
She's in opposition.
Yeah, she's in opposition. That's right. Yeah, they're in government, right, and may still be in government for some time. But what does that say about what I really think about the state of things? If they go into opposition, they have an opportunity, I hope, to try to do something about it. But I don't think Gillard could have done it. I mean, I think the whole polls problem that Kerry-Anne talks about so well in her book is because both sides of the equation, the politicians, the party and the media, are out of touch with the community, and so they rely heavily on polls.
Well, that was the next issue that I wanted to bring up, and maybe I'll address that to you, Jonathan, but you guys feel free to jump in. I mean, it comes out again and again through Kerry-Anne's book that every time a poll comes out, it seems this seismic event, and the focus on focus groups, the focus on polling seems to be something new and distinct. I mean, is this your sense that the polling, that the permanent campaign that we're seeing now?
Well, certainly Kerry-Anne makes a big point about that in the book, and I don't entirely share her view. I mean, I think this was a very unusual government. This was a hung parliament. This was, for the first few months, certainly Tony Abbott expected that at any minute there would be an election.
Well, he only had a one-year strategy. I mean, his strategy. He believed that the Parliament would fall over within a year.
Exactly, and therefore, but so did all the journalists. Everyone, no one had any real expectation this was going to last 3 years, and so the polls were. There was a sense that we were in election campaigns all the time, and therefore the polls were much more important than they would have been if they'd had a majority of 30 or 40.
But why were they? I mean, if the government was getting on with the job, if the government was getting on with the job of governing and trying to get reforms up and all that, why was it necessary twice, 3 times a week through Galaxy polls, AC Nielsen, News Poll, Reachtel, all of these sorts of polls to be monitoring it, taking its pulse?
Well, you tell me, you were in the press gallery. Well, I mean, that's what I want the book to tell me.
But,
I actually was. I left the press gallery in 2009. There was an absolute. There has been a huge increase in the number of polls. It used to be just News Poll every fortnight, and I've just been reading a book by Jim Chalmers, a former advisor to both Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard, and he says it's not just the media focus on it that seems to really dumb down the political discourse between Australian people through the media and the politicians, but it also encourages short-termism in policy making, because politicians become so incredibly reliant on the polls, and so they're actually making brave but quite often decisions that don't suit the electorate at a particular time. They're brave, but they may be unpopular. It actually shuts that down because they get scared.
But my point is simply that if you have a solid majority, then everybody knows you have got 3 years. And the polls are to that extent irrelevant. That was not the case, especially in the early months and maybe the first year of the Gillard government. There was a general expectation that there could be, the whole thing could fall over. And so I think that does explain to some extent that sort of obsessive poll watching.
That was a factor of
the other thing that's going on surely in Australia more generally is that as parties atrophy, as parties hollow out, more and more what politics is about is this direct communication between the people and the leader. And what is so extraordinary about Kevin Rudd is this, and I don't know any parallel to this in anywhere I've ever lived, this extraordinary disjunction between how the great public out there see him and how the cognoscenti in Canberra see him. That wasn't the case with Howard. I mean, Howard was actually a very competent Prime Minister. He was very respected by the public, but he was respected in Canberra too. Not by everybody and not by the people who disagree with his policies, but on the whole, you can't say he was an incompetent Prime Minister. This disjunction is really fascinating and scary.
Well, before we move on to talking specifically about the media, I wanted to put that to you because, I mean, this is the obvious kind of coda to the story that you tell in the book, because as we know, Julia Gillard was replaced by Kevin Rudd, and now the polls tell us that Labor is either neck and neck. Some polls have them slightly ahead. What does that change about our assessment of that period, if anything? Do we now think, was Labor wrong to get rid of Rudd in the first place? Should they have moved earlier, later? Does the polling that we're seeing now change our perception? And if so, how? Well, that's for all three of you. Quickly, 25 words.
Con, you go, Jim.
Was Labor wrong to get rid of Kevin Rudd in 2010? The thing that has, at the time, I remember thinking, well, that makes absolute sense that that's happened. I supported it. I still think it was the right thing to do. Whether it was the right timing is something that I've worried about a lot. If they had waited longer, clearly, events have shown, it's easy to be wise with hindsight, that Australians had not woken up to the dysfunction of the government. And had they woken up to that, had two things happened. Had they woken up to the dysfunction of the government, and had Gillard and her people been able to find a way to tell the full truth about what was going on in the government, then things might be different. This is very easy to say now.
Yeah.
And it would have been very hard for Julia Gillard to have stood up and said, in June 2010, this government was dysfunctional and its leader was dysfunctional. That would have been very hard to do because she was the deputy, for a start. And she had been very loyal to Rudd. I don't believe these stories that she had not been loyal. I think she'd been loyal right to the end. But for her to have done that, when she's just done this incredible act of slaying a Prime Minister just 2.5 years after he's had this historic victory over John Howard, very, very hard, but they had to find a way to do it, and they didn't. And this line that this is a good government that's lost its way was utterly inadequate.
And isn't it also the case, though, Kerry, that and again, I think for me, reading your book, you didn't quite give this enough importance, but Gillard is a lousy communicator. I mean, that's a fact. She's just no good at talking to the public. Yes, she was a bloody good, everyone tells us, in Canberra. She was excellent. She was a very good negotiator, all of that stuff. But she was no good at getting that message across. And so you had the converse, this man who's hopeless governor who seems to be able to, magically communicate with the public in a way that beats me, and then you've got a highly competent woman who previously gave every sign of being a very good communicator who suddenly dried up and couldn't do it. And it was the contrast of the two things that was a problem, wasn't it?
Well, yeah, sure. She had she was not unlike other leaders. I mean, for obvious reasons. One, she was female. Two, she had she also had a particular public manner that was at odds with the very warm personality that she is and still.
I mean, I think Helen Clark, for example, in New Zealand was perfectly able to communicate. I don't think it's anything to do with a woman, personally.
Yeah, no. I wasn't actually saying that. But what I do think is that if given a preference between a sound policymaker, someone with calm judgment, someone who is reasoned, intelligent, and an expert negotiator, or a show pony, I'll go for the former every time as a voter.
Okay,
well voters don't. That's the trouble.
And that's the issue about our system.
They did with Paul Keating. I mean, they did with John Howard was fairly awkward and clunky. He wasn't a show pony.
No, but
well, I mean, if we're talking about communication, I guess that's the other big aspect of this story, the extraordinary media coverage that happened through that time. And I guess that's very much part of the story that you tell in the book. And for me, one of the most interesting aspects of the Team Rudd versus Team Gillard that comes out in your book is the fact that Team Rudd seems to consist, at least partially, in fact, often primarily, of members of the media. So perhaps can you talk about what is behind this? What was it that led so many journalists, or some journalists anyway, to identify, not to simply report on, but to identify with this campaign?
Well, I don't. What I did was present it. I wasn't trying to explore too deeply behind the personal the reasons for individual journalists, but broadly there's a complex background which includes the disintegration or the diminution, if you like, of traditional media, the need to fill the 24/7 news cycle, the easy and cheap option of not having an investigative style of journalism anymore, but just being somebody tells you something, bang, it goes out on the wires. The thrill of the chase, the obvious attachment of many senior journalists to Kevin Rudd, who is an incredible media duchesser, whereas Julia Gillard was not. And so there were a number of things that went into that. And there's also, when you do work in the gallery, as James would know, although he hasn't worked up there, but he's worked in Canberra, there is an incredible need to... it's very difficult to be the one to break away and to be independent when the pack's on, if you like. And I think that some of that played into it. The sub-editors have gone from major newspapers. Fact-checking is not like it was 10 years ago. The use of anonymous sources is almost de rigueur now. You just use them and you don't have to justify it. It doesn't matter if they're balanced out. So there was a lot of factors at play. Okay,
all three of you are experienced journalists. Perhaps you could tell us, is this a new thing for journalists to intervene so overtly in a leadership struggle like this? Or has this happened all the time and this is the first that we're hearing about, or is it a new phenomenon?
It's new, isn't it? At this level, it's new. one of the things that I think is really great about Kerry-Anne's book is the forensic way in which she unpacks what's happened in the last 3 years, and she just goes story after story. We all read the papers in the last 3 years and all read those stories which say, 3 MPs say, the tide, is shifting to Kevin Rudd, or a Rudd backer says, or friends of Rudd say, there's a senior Victorian Liberal who you could parse his anonymous quotes. He would say to people off the record, things, but you couldn't ever say he said it. You had to say friends of this person said it. And there's a lot of that happening in Canberra at the moment. So what Kerry-Anne has done is to actually go back and unpack all of that stuff. And it's when you read that, you think, well, this is so strange that we've had months and years of this. I don't think it's... Jonathan, what do you think? Do you think
look, I've never been a political journalist. The press gallery in Canberra is a mystery to me. And that's why I was hoping, to be honest, for a bit more analysis of what was going on from somebody who does understand it. For example, the gorilla in the room, the Murdoch press. To what extent does Gemma Jones or Simon Benson write what they write because they're being told to by their editors, or because they know that their editors expect?
Well, you try and get that information out of the editors.
This is a really important issue. But of course, they weren't alone. I mean, as you point out, Peter Hartcher famously was one of the great spruikers for Rudd, although he denies it. But I don't know why that is the case. But certainly the news, and especially the Daily Telegraph, had a completely anti-Gillard agenda that was quite extraordinary. And I've never seen such a dominance of the news pages. That's the important thing. I don't care what the columnists write, but the screwing of the news every day was really extraordinary. And I can only assume that was a deliberate policy either of the editor, and I think it did change markedly when Whittaker came in to edit the Daily Telegraph. I think you saw a real change there. Of course, he came from the Australian, where you had seen similar things going on all the way through. Yep. So I think the interplay between the senior Canberra journalists and the editors back in Sydney or Melbourne, I'm really interested in that, and I don't understand it, and I don't know if you do.
Can I just say one quick thing? I think the fact that the press gallery totally missed the first,
absolutely,
made them completely. We're not going to miss it again. Yeah, and so
it did. It made them hypervigilant. And a number of them acknowledge that it did make them hypervigilant, and ministers acknowledge that. They say all of a sudden it was ratcheted up. I mean, if somebody had looked at somebody in a different way, almost. It was it's on. I mean, just before the no-show challenge in March, when the rumours went around the house that Simon Crean had gone in, or was about to go in, or had gone in to pat Julia Gillard or tap her on the shoulder by Simon Crean, and great banks of cameras arrive in the corridors outside the PMO, the Parliamentary Office, and there was no such thing. Not only that, Simon Crean wasn't in the building, and he wasn't even in Canberra.
Can I suggest, just one other question though, that is worth considering, which is the phenomenon of online journalism and the fact that for the first time in 150 years, editors know what people read and know what people don't read. And because they can see it in the clicks. And I think what they've discovered is that people don't read policy stories. Everyone says they want policy stories, but they don't read them. What they read is leadership stories. And so some of this is being driven by what we actually read. Yeah. And especially with the popular newspapers.
Or maybe not even what people read, is just so much what people comment on.
Well, you cannot track it all with Google Analytics. You can watch it live as a traffic. Well, I have a question pertaining to that as well. I mean, to what extent is some of this a product of structural changes? I mean, you have this digital revolution working its way through the media, so you have these media empires with ever-declining resources and an ever-growing hunger for content, and of course, the cheapest content to produce is punditry, so there's a proliferation of everyone you can stick in front of a camera can give you an opinion on the leadership situation, whether Julia Gillard's doing a good job or whatever. I mean, are we moving to a situation where more and more journalists are no longer reporters but are pundits, and are thus constantly engaging in these debates.
The speculation.
Yeah.
Well, I just think that was a really quite peculiar and out-of-the-box period. And if you notice, it was almost like the switches were flicked off as soon as Rudd came back in. It was right back to business. We've got everything down back in its rightful place, and everybody got on with the job. I mean, there was simply no dissection of him except in a few columns and what he'd been like over the previous 3 years. I mean, there was a complete absence of any sort of scrutiny about his role, and yet, pardon? Abbott for 3.5 years,
Should we move to a situation where, I mean, The Guardian was talking about this a couple of weeks ago, should we move to a situation where political journalists should declare their partisan affiliations and say, well, I'm a Liberal voter, I'm a Labor voter, and be upfront about where they're coming from?
But I don't think that's what it's about here, Jeff. I think it's about the use of anonymous sources, people who are not experienced. I mean, with the kind of hunger, as you said, Jonathan, the lack of interest in policy stories and the great interest in leadership stories, the hung parliament, a lot of inexperienced journalists. I think it's easy to round up a couple of anonymous MPs, and if your editor wants to make that a story, then it's a story.
Yeah, but it's not the very experienced ones were doing it too. The Dennis Shanahans, the Peter Harchers, they were all doing
that. Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
That's true.
Well,
so I can't.
Five or six or a dozen people who are always going to be in a caucus who are dissatisfied at any given time for whatever reason, their own ambitions, or they didn't like being bumped out of this committee, or whatever it is that's made them disgruntled. To elevate their whisperings and their problems to front page stories over and above the 100 who are actually satisfied and content with their leader was just so out of perspective, and it went on day in, day out, week in, week out, month in, month out, and it completely distorted the picture of the Gillard government.
Can I ask Jonathan and Kerry-Anne a question about whether you think this might lead or should lead to a revisiting of journalist code of ethics? And Michael Gawenda, you quote this in your book, Kerry-Anne, that he said, if a politician says one thing off the record and then stands up at a news conference and says the exact opposite. So, for example, if Kevin Rudd said to journalists, I'm going to challenge next month, and then stands up and says, I'm totally loyal to the leader, I won't challenge, should the journalist then be released from his or her duty of keeping the conversation off the record?
We actually looked at this quite carefully in Media Watch at the time, that February 2012. Barry Cassidy was raising those kinds of questions, who's here tonight, and David Pemberthy from News Limited was raising those questions. And of course, famously, Michael Brissenden of the ABC and two other journalists in 2007, I think it was 6, outed Peter Costello precisely because he had denied something that he had told them 2 years earlier. And that was a very unusual action and was condemned by a great many press gallery journalists.
That's a different situation, John. That was a one-off. It was over.
But I mean, we asked a lot of journalists what they thought about this, and the ones that answered all said, no. I mean, Dennis Shanahan particularly said this, quite openly and at great length in a response to us. No, it doesn't matter what they say. Your obligation is to maintain that confidentiality. Frequently, they will get up and deny what they've said to you.
Yeah, but surely in the episodes, say, over the last 3 years, where, I mean, it used to be if a politician would take you into their confidence or you tell you something off the record that couldn't be used or whatever, it was for reasons that were that were bigger. That they were reasons not just trying to gather momentum through the use of the media for a particular political outcome. And so if you know you are being used to gain momentum, if you know that those numbers aren't there, which they proved to be not there in February, proved to be not there in March, although close, maybe, depending on who you listen to, then surely you have a responsibility when this person again tries to run the line to say, I'm not going to listen to you anymore.
Well, yeah, that's a different thing, though. To say, no, I'm not going to listen to you is different from sticking your hand up and saying, Mr. Rudd denied he was briefing journalists, he briefed me. That's what Barry and people were saying should happen.
And it certainly changed the game.
I'm not saying it shouldn't happen. I mean, I don't know.
I remember back in the in the Court Keating days. And one of those two called a very senior journalist in and started to tell them the game plan. And this journalist was at the ABC, said, "Stop. You go any further, I'm telling you I'm not going to keep this. I'm not going to keep this confidence because you're making me a player." So...
Well, I mean, I wanted to ask about that, and I guess it goes again to looking back in history, knowing what we know now, because one of the big claims that was made over and over again, it comes out in your book, was that the constant speculation about the leadership challenge was in fact driving the leadership challenge. It would come up every time there'd be Q&A. The first 3 or 4 questions would be about it. Will there be a challenge? Will there be a challenge? What do we say about that now that we know that there was a challenge, that in fact, in fact Julia Gillard did give way to Kevin Rudd, in fact that all of this burbling was going along under the surface, it wasn't
but
just...
But he was going to keep going. I mean, it was going to keep... It was not going to stop.
Well, so was it legitimate to keep asking that question? I mean, because the suggestion at the time was that these questions, there is no substance to it. You shouldn't be asking this, you shouldn't be focusing on this so much because there's no substance to it. In retrospect, we clearly know there was substance to it.
But there was substance to it in June, but there was not substance to it leading up to February 2012. It was one of the greatest leadership wallopings in a ballot, 71-31, it's not insignificant. Then, in March, Kevin Rudd acknowledged that, in fact, he hadn't challenged, not because he wasn't on, it was because he was honouring his word. It was because he had, in his words, zero chance of getting the majority he wanted, and it kept going anyway. Ultimately, I think that some of them just went, we're just going down the plug hole here anyway because it's not going to stop.
It's not often that you have a government that is polling around 30% for 3 years. That's very unusual. So I mean, the polls, I know you can say, well, we shouldn't pay attention to the polls, but that was driving this thing all along. That's why Kevin Rudd is now Prime Minister. It's the polls.
And do you also accept that if the picture out there in the community of a government racked by these internal divisions, where there was no ability to get her message out on the reform agenda that was significant, had anything to do with driving down the polls?
Absolutely. That's the chicken and egg thing.
Yeah.
That's what's so hard to disentangle.
Look, we've got about 10 minutes before we go to questions. I want to go to the other obvious question that we haven't dealt with at all, which is, of course, the question of gender. How big a factor was this in the ongoing campaign against Julia Gillard? How much of a factor was it that in the situation that we now have Kevin Rudd in power?
I'm going to defer to Kerry-Anne and Jonathan, but just to say, I think Gillard said it quite well herself. It wasn't everything and it wasn't nothing.
It wasn't nothing.
I think we shouldn't think it was everything. I think there were lots of other factors at play, and we've discussed some of them tonight, but certainly wasn't nothing. We've lived through such a kind of strange time. I think it's going to take a while to get clarity on this, and the debate about the role of gender has just begun, I think. Maybe we can discuss this later, but certainly when you have people like Alan Jones, I mean, some of the things that were said about Gillard, and you've got a lot of it in your book, Kerry-Anne, things that would never have been said about a male Prime Minister.
Jones is just outrageous.
Yeah. But not just Jones.
But he was.
Yeah.
But
it was that whole stable. It was Jones, it was Hadley, it was, it was that 2GB, it was wall to wall from breakfast to dusk. It was just one great tidal wave
and Chris Smith and
vile insults against Julia and Julia Gillard, and I just can't. And also, then you had the others writing in the tabloids, the News Limited tabloids, who were just this constant voice of condemnation and belittling, and it was just awful.
But Kerry-Anne, I was really interested in your treatment of that famous misogyny speech because you said that you did not think, and most press gallery people did not think, that Tony Abbott is a misogynist. And that's a really important statement, it seems to me, because that is why the gallery reported it so differently from the way in which that speech was received in the blogosphere and by women especially outside Canberra. Again, it's this disjunction. But But I think most, correct me because we were there, I don't know, but it seemed to me the press gallery thought she was playing politics with this speech. They didn't actually think she really meant it.
I don't think. Well, she did. I mean, you could tell she meant it.
Yeah, but I mean,
I think it was not so much directed. It was definitely directed at Tony Abbott, but she was probably had in her mind's eye a lot of the others that had treated her in such a vile manner.
Do you think Gillard had any expectation it would become this viral sensation?
No, I don't.
And it was very personally aimed at Abbott.
Yes,
I mean,
it was personally aimed at him for sure.
Well, her father had died not long ago. Jones had made his comments, which had been reported, and Abbott had picked up Jones's comments and said, died of shame.
That's right. Yes.
So she was pretty steamed up at that point.
Yeah.
I think it had been sort of 18 months in the steaming, but it really had.
But what a lot of the men in the press gallery lectured her about was her. It wasn't so much the politics of it. They were telling her that she was letting women down by that. Yeah. I mean, it was just the most bizarre interpretation.
Yes. Because of Slipper and so
because of which in fact what she was doing was saying let the courts deal with this man. This is not. Let's not have a kangaroo court.
Come back to the issue. I mean, I don't know. I'm not sure that it was primarily because of her gender in the press gallery. I do think it was hugely to do with her gender in terms of the way that the shock jocks dealt with it.
Yeah, absolutely. It wasn't. I don't think it was in the gallery either.
But
bar a few.
It did seem, though, that there was this tremendous kind of catch-22 in her responses, that she was in this position where if she didn't respond, then all the abuse and the whispering and the emails would continue. The moment that she did respond, then she was immediately accused of playing the gender card, not being able to hack it, and all the rest of it. So let me put that to you. Was there anything that she could have done differently? I mean, how should the next female Prime Minister learn from this experience? What could have been done differently?
What woman was going to put her hand up, frankly, after what
she's
been through?
Is that your conclusion from it? I mean, do you think
I think it would be. I think it'll be I think it'll be quite some time. I just think she really was subjected to. Of course, there were circumstances and a confluence of circumstances that were very significant for her at the time, and it was a remarkable time with the minority parliament. But I would be amazed if there was another female prime minister within the next generation or two.
Do you think the media has learnt anything about dealing with women in public life? Do you think they should have learned something?
The blokes out there in shock jock land, I don't think they learn anything. I don't think they learn any lessons. I think that they're appealing to a particular audience, and they're screaming at that particular audience. And
it's an old male audience. It's not.
That's right.
One shouldn't get too swept away. I mean, 2GB is great for Media Watch. We love it, but But yes, it's a big audience. But as I think Richard Glover told me, because the way they measure the ratings, it's actually not as big as it looks, because it's just that people listen to it for 3 hours. These are old blokes who get up in the morning, they switch on 2GB and they don't turn it off till they go to bed at night, and that gives you a very high rating.
Terrible night's sleep after 2GB.
Yeah. But Anna Bligh, for example, I don't think she was, and Queensland is not, a state renowned for its kind of enlightened attitudes. I don't think Anna Bligh was treated too badly. I mean, or that differently from, was she? I don't know. I mean, I don't live in Queensland, but I didn't get that impression.
Do you have any sense that were there particular lessons that the media should learn? I mean, it's easy to talk about the shock jocks, I guess, because it's the sort of lowest of the low. But I mean, should the broadsheet press have done things differently? Are there any lessons that they should take from this experience?
About women, coverage
about treating women in public life.
Yeah.
You asking me?
I'm asking you.
I'm not convinced that it was such an important factor. Outside of, I think it might well have been very important with older men and the way that they reacted in Western Sydney and places like that. I'm not convinced that it was such a big deal, in Canberra. But I don't live in Canberra. I don't work in Canberra. I mean, Kerry-Anne knows far more than I do about that.
No, I don't think it was a big deal in Canberra.
Right, and
look, I finished reading Kerry-Anne's book persuaded that it was much more about the destabilisation caused by Rudd, not about the gender issue as such, and Yeah, I think I'm with Jonathan on that.
One of the ironies is that Julia got the job because she was so respected by the party for what she'd done up to that point, and because she was such a good parliamentary performer and she was such a good communicator. And somehow, and it's nothing to do with her being a woman, it's to do with what the Prime Ministership did to her, all of that disappeared suddenly, almost overnight. That was much more important than the fact that she was a woman, I thought.
All right, well, just quickly before we go to questions, just a counterfactual then. What would have happened had Rudd not replaced Gillard? I mean, would Gillard have had any chance in this election coming up? Could she have fought back from where she was? If you three were faceless, I was going to say faceless men, faceless people, would you have thought that Gillard could claw her way back from where she was?
No, I don't think she could have clawed her way back.
Nor do I.
No. I don't think so.
Two hard, faceless men over there.
Certainly not with the factors that were continually at play and had been at play for all her Prime Ministership.
Yeah, I don't think things were going to change. No. And I think there would have been some convergence once it had been clear that it was Gillard versus Abbott, but I don't think enough to have swung the result.
No, I think, when everyone kept saying the public stopped listening, I think that's true. And they are listening now, and they'll listen for about another 3.5 weeks. I don't know.
Well, all right, on the note of listening to the public, why don't we now go to questions? I actually find it very difficult to see. Are there any hands up?
Yep. There are.
There are, okay. Well,
I just wonder
fair enough.
About female journalists, the way they interpreted the news, particularly Michelle Grattan. How she was such a brilliant writer in her earlier days, and she finished off in a dismal fashion as far as I was concerned. And I just wonder if there was anything personal or anything, she didn't get a cup of tea or something like that.
Okay, the question is about Michelle.
Can I say, yes. Look, I'm going to defend Michelle. I know a lot of people think that she hasn't done well, and you have some criticism of her in your book, Kerry-Anne. I don't think she has an agenda against Gillard. I just don't. I think she clearly formed a view that the government wasn't functioning well, but I don't think it's personal. I don't. She's a very fair-minded person, and perhaps she made some misjudgments in some, I don't know, but I think her reporting over years has been very fair-minded.
Well, just generally on the question, do you think there was a distinction between how female journalists reported on Gillard as opposed to how male journalists?
Not that I saw, no. Kerry-Anne, what do you think?
No, I think that certainly Gillard and Rudd and Abbott, they all polarise journalists, they polarise commentators. I thought that Michelle was harsh on Julia Gillard on occasions, and when she had made judgments that were then found to be flawed, then there wasn't any sort of way of her sort of retracting what she'd said. I did find the voices a lot stronger in this period from all the journalists and all the commentators, much stronger in either their usually the condemnation. There was very little praise for what Julia Gillard was doing as the Prime Minister. It was always the voice of, seemed to be a collective voice of condemnation.
I agree with that, and I find that puzzling. The people who I'd respected, who suddenly just really took against her, like Michelle, like Peter Hartshell, lots of those people, really took against her, and that was more than, and Kerry-Anne is saying, hey, she was running a good government. I don't know. I don't understand that.
What happened, Jonathan? Because it's widely said about Gillard that if you sit down with her, she's a very likeable person, very respectful.
Was it because she did not cultivate the journalist the way that previous Prime Ministers did?
Well, you'd be very hard pushed to cultivate the journalist the way Kevin Rudd does, because he's extremely adept at it.
But the way that Howard did, for example.
Howard had a very different style also, and he was extremely disciplined in the way he went about dealing with the media and trying to set the news agenda for the day, and having people that he dealt with in the gallery. It was a lot more on a professional footing. Julia Gillard, I understand, tried, but it's not her nature. She actually is somebody who is reserved, and she did try and explain herself on a number of occasions to the press gallery through press club addresses. And she was trying in one particular address to say, "Look, I'm actually just a shy girl from a background. We've brought ourselves up by our bootstraps, so to speak, and I worked hard. I graduated from only high school. I've done law. I'm just trying to do the best I can." And the headlines the next day were teary Julia Gillard defending herself.
All right, we'll go to another question over there somewhere.
It's actually a bit more of a comment. I couldn't help thinking, although there were some interesting points and much that I agreed with in this conversation, but there also seemed to be a theme of a fear of the onslaught of the great unwashed, whether it's in the form of poll-driven politics and the deterioration of established media and all these new voices and coming in. And I mean, I don't like to be sounding so right-wing, but that's democracy and it's kind of messy, And I have to say, on the other side of this talk and these concerns about this, as I said, deterioration in media, which I also share, but there also is a greater ability to participate in that conversation, and I would not claim that I ought to be as respected as any of you or that my judgment's worth more, but like as a brown skin, at one point kind of low income single mother, I was able to give my thoughts, and whether it was what I might hope was a carefully considered analytical piece for New Matilda or a bitchy blog piece for Crikey about the first Blake's arse, I could do it,
Yeah,
and I
great.
could. And so, is it such a concern then? And I also get that we need the press gallery. We can't write opinion pieces unless we're getting reporting.
But are you getting reporting? That's
well,
the thing. I mean, in that period, were you getting reporting?
Can I ask you a question?
Were you getting commentary?
Sorry, can I interrupt you?
Yep, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, when you say that there's a fear of the great unwashed up here, are you saying in terms of that we haven't acknowledged that public support for Kevin Rudd is very large and that we should respect that? Is that your point?
Not exactly, although I would say that and I got a bit irate with this kind of line of, you haven't seen the real Kevin Rudd or the real Julia. If you saw him, you'd realise that Tintin was actually not so cute, and if you saw her, you'd realise she was charming. That's really not a line you can only push it so far. But it wasn't so much even about the leadership. It was more the sort of, as much as we might like the old media, at least they knew the rules and they played according to them, and now those are gone and it's just chaos, Sure. And I get that, and I do have concerns about the direction of media and polling and much else. Okay. But at the same time, is there a way that we can frame that conversation that doesn't sound quite so? And I'm sure it wasn't your intention to sound, but it's kind of how it sounds.
Okay. Do we have another question up the back?
Yes, we do. Jonathan mentioned that Julia couldn't sell her message. Having watched her perform in Parliament in question time over many years, having listened to her deliver amazing speeches off the cuff, from the heart, I would just like to ask the 3 or 4 of you, what role do you think her minders and speechwriters played in her demise?
That's a question for the speechwriter, perhaps.
Yeah.
Look, I don't think they can be blamed. I think that when these things happen, there are many causes. We were circling around it here when we talked about her inability to communicate somehow. That is clearly. I agree with you. I think she was terrific in Parliament, very good parliamentary performer, can give very good speeches, but somehow that side of her didn't get out while she was Prime Minister. I'm not sure why. I think we've touched on some of the reasons. I think she was under incredible pressure, and interesting. When you look back, things were actually going quite well early on, and then there was the leaks in the 2010 election, and sort of things started rolling from then. In a way. Do you know?
Okay. Do we have any more? There is someone there, I think.
Hi. You discussed the change in journalism in regards to anonymous sources, polls, punditry, the lack of investigative journalism. Do you feel there's a way back from that? And if so, how, particularly given this economic climate?
Yeah, I certainly. I think online, the newspaper circulation is falling. Newspapers are pretty much dying out. They're never going to die out completely, but their business model's pretty well stuffed. And so you've still got a very active press gallery, though, and so they're using a lot of their resources just to pour content into online stories and update constantly and be the first to have the latest on this or the latest on that, even if there's actually not real news in it. So way back, the Global Mail was started by Graham Wood to try and bring investigative journalism back to this country, and I'm pretty sure that's not working too well. There's The Guardian Online, which is a quality outlet, and of course you've got the rise of outlets like Crikey and Hoopla and New Matilda and all these sorts of things, which are, they're gaining an influence, and that's good. It's great diversity.
That's just more opinion, really. I think. I mean, they're not the digging. The real digging stories are really expensive and really hard to do. And to be fair, I mean, the Sydney Morning Herald, The Age, even the Australian actually still do it. We would not have had the whole ADO bead scandal without the Sydney Morning Herald.
Yeah, true.
We would not have had a whole bunch of security and a whole bunch of other stories without the Age's investigative unit. You might disapprove of it, but we thought at Media Watch that Hedley Thomas's work on the AWU scandal was in fact valid, and was raising legitimate questions about what happened on that occasion. These things are still going on, but they are, I agree, swamped by what is not happening. Is that it's just a straight reporting. That doesn't work anymore, and what everyone said, but the press gallery is doing is giving us opinion every morning over our cornflakes instead of actually telling us what happened, and that's
just as an aside. There's 200 people here. Put your hand up if you subscribe to a newspaper.
Well, that's quite a lot.
Yeah. Oh well, there you go.
Is that online or the newspaper versions?
Yeah. All right. Sorry, I didn't mean to derail the questions. I think we do have time for perhaps one or two more. There's one up there.
Just speak.
It's a microphone.
Oh, look, just a comment, really. Back in around about 1981, Lindy Chamberlain was... I suppose what I'm saying is whenever I look at the way the press and the public viewed Julia Gillard, it reminded me of the way that Lindy Chamberlain was treated back in the early 80s. That was all.
Okay. Well, unless you know what's coming, we'll just keep moving. Is there another question? Yes, over somewhere?
Yes, thank you. I would like to ask a question.
Okay. Have you got a microphone? Sorry, I was just struggling to see.
I would like to ask what your opinions are on the role of News Limited in this whole scenario. Now, through the whole Howard years, every time, and it was quite often, mind you, it wasn't commented on as much as when Labour goes, but every time he went overseas, the first person he touched base with was Rupert Murdoch. We had a scenario here at the Arts Centre some months back where some very dubious characters were there with the so-called Australian Independent think tank, including Archbishop or Cardinal or Pell, or whatever his name is, who are obviously people who make decisions about Australian foreign policy and all sorts of policies. Now, to me, in observing politics ever since my arrival in this country in the 1960s, I saw a huge swing when Julia Gillard came into power by the Australian and, nobody has mentioned television, SBS, putting across fairly right-wing views on everything, all and sundry.
All right, so the question
and it seems to me that News Limited has played a huge role in this, and I'd like you to comment on
the
it.
question is about News Limited's role.
Well, I think Jonathan's already talked about the Daily Telegraph, and there's no doubt that the Telegraph was not on Julia Gillard's side. The Australian was also right from the word go when the deal with the agreement was reached with the Greens. The Australian editorialised that they'd do everything in their power basically to break that deal. And Bob Brown, the Greens leader, said that he got to the point where he would not speak to a journalist from News Limited because he feared how his comments would be treated. And so there was a definite and very proclaimed and pronounced bias against the Labor-Greens alliance that was run through the News Limited papers, but particularly in the Australian. And I think there's absolutely no doubt that they had took a very dim view of Julia Gillard's prime ministership, and also an exceptionally dim view of the Treasurer Wayne Swan.
It's a conundrum, News Limited, if you're not in it. Here's what we know. There was a meeting that Rupert Murdoch held with his editors, I think in California, in the very early months of the Gillard government, immediately after the election. And it is said, we don't know this, it is said that an edict went out, I want this woman gone. We also know that certain News Limited papers are far more strident in their pursuit of Gillard in particular than others. The Courier-Mail, for example, in Brisbane has been reasonably even-handed. The Advertiser in Adelaide has been reasonably even-handed. The Herald Sun has been much less even-handed, and the Daily Telegraph has been feral. Editors have enormous power in News Limited. They have tremendous independence, much more so than in Fairfax these days, to run their papers the way they want. And it is said, again, this is more rumour than anything, that Chris Mitchell at the Australian and Paul Whittaker, who was his amanuensis at the Australian and now runs the Telegraph, are very, very close, sort of direct line to Murdoch. They can pick up the phone and talk to him, and they are essentially protected from Kim Williams, the boss of News, what we now have to call News Corp Australia. Kim can't really touch those two in particular. Now, this is all kind of rumour. We don't really know whether Rupert Murdoch is driving this, whether editors are doing what they think Rupert wants, which certainly happens right the way through. But it is, the problem is that Murdoch does own an awful lot of newspapers in Australia and has far more influence than he should have.
So just quickly, conundrum's a good word, Jonathan. It's very hard. It's important to understand that it's very difficult to understand at the moment. It is really complicated, the situation in Australian politics and media. Things are changing very fast. There are two countervailing trends. One is, as the questioner pointed out, there are a lot more voices. There is opportunity for people who haven't been part of the media landscape to step up, and if their comments or their work is interesting, it will get a much wider audience than it would have ever got before, and that's great. At the same time, we still have this massive ownership, this concentration of ownership. For advanced democracy, it's one of the most concentrated media in the world. So, two trends more than that, but how it all, where it all goes, I don't know. We'll see.
Okay, we're right on time. I think we can probably squeeze in one last question.
Thank you very much. Everybody's been talking about the faceless men behind Labor. What about the faceless men in big business, capitalist big business corporations that actually run this country, that own the media? And I'm sick to death of us focusing on just the politicians and what they do wrong. What about the people behind the scenes? They're far more dangerous, and they're going further and further to the right. They never liked Julia's policies because they were socialist democrat policies. She wanted to basically have everybody have a go, everybody have some wealth. These other people that are behind the media, these journalists and all that, they're not just in the media because they are self-employed. They're not self-employed, they're employed by people with an agenda, a very dangerous agenda.
Yeah, but again, it's very dangerous, if I may say so, to assume that senior journalists are told what to write. I don't believe that happens. but there are cultures, aren't there?
Yeah, there are. Yeah, definite cultures in newspapers, most definitely. It's interesting because this book I was just referring to by Jim Chalmers called Glory Days, he goes in on a fair bit about that and the vested interests behind the scenes and how dominating they were. And Wayne Swan, the former Deputy Prime Minister and Treasurer, also wrote a quarterly essay on that. And so, there is a strong school of thought that the powerful business interests have been extremely influential in helping barrel the Gillard government.
It's quite interesting to look at the Financial Review, for example. When Michael Stutchbury took over the Financial Review, it was regarded, I think, by Fairfax as losing readership to the Australian because it was not sufficiently favourable to business. It was the business paper that was anti-business because a lot of the Fairfax journalists were quite anti-business. And Michael Stutchbury was brought back from the Australian to put the Fin Review back into competition with the Australian business news of being pro-business, which is clearly what the AFR now is, and especially big resources industry. So these things, are sometimes just policy of trying to scramble back some readers. It's about it's no more than the fight for commercial survival in some cases. But yes, of course, those big business is powerful to some extent.
And they've had some big successes lately, haven't they? I mean, stopping the mining tax.
Diluting the mining tax.
And diluting the Kevin Rudd's carbon scheme.
And the mining tax was astonishingly badly explained by the media. Nobody bothered to bloody well explain it. I was furious at the time, I remember. You couldn't find it anywhere.
Well, also, though, John, the government just dropped it on the public. It was the time.
True.
There was no... Yeah. If you look back at the last mining tax in 1984, you might even remember, Kerry-Anne, that Peter Walsh and Paul Keating had 6 months of debate. Three white papers.
That's
discussion.
right.
Huge debate. And the
Where
government
are white papers
we're
these
doing
days?
it. We're doing it. That's stopped.
There's announcements sketched on the back of envelopes and then announced.
I think we have extended a little bit on our time, and we could continue this discussion almost indefinitely, I'm sure. But I ask you again to join me in thanking our three guests, Kerry-Anne Walsh, Jonathan Holmes and James Button. Just a reminder, The Stalking of Julia Gillard is available. Avenue Bookstore is selling it out there, I'm sure, with many other fine books. Thank you very much for coming along tonight.